Good afternoon. I'm Peter Wood, President of the National Association of Scholars. Thank you for being with us today. We are here to release the new report titled Wasteland, the Education Department's Profligacy, Mediocrity, and Radicalism. I'm joined by two of the authors, David Randall and Teresa Manning. This is something of an odd occasion in that we wrote this report thinking that we might be trying to convince public policymakers to do something about pulling the Department of Education down to earth and perhaps downsizing it, removing some of its functions and putting them elsewhere in the government, perhaps anticipating that in a while it might be a good idea to retire the whole department. But before we got to press, it became clear that the President of the United States was getting there before us. So we've hastened to release our report quickly, and here it is. The idea here is that we are going to talk about what's in the report in a few minutes. I'm going to give a preface to it at this point. Why do we have a Department of Education? It was not part of the original ordering of government functions in this country. It's not in our Constitution. Before we even had a Constitution, when we were still governed by the Articles of Confederation, one of the first great laws we had was the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance provided that there should be some federal involvement in higher education. In fact, in a single sentence it says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to a good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. That encouragement took the form of basically tax breaks in the Northwest Territory, setting aside the sale of government land in order to support the rise of schools. Now, we didn't have a Department of Education then. In fact, the first 9 colleges in the country, all of which still existed, were able to grow out of the fertile soil of American colonialism. We existed through most of our history without a Department of Education. There was a brief exception to that after the Civil War. President Andrew Johnson created a Department of Education which lasted less than 2 years and then was retired into a single agency as part of another department. And thus things remained until 1979, when President Jimmy Carter signed into law the authorizing legislation for the Department of Education that we have today. Interestingly, the justification for that Department of Education was that it was going to centralize the functions that were then distributed through other departments. But if you read about what the Department of Education says about itself over the years, it puts a very strong emphasis on how decentralized it is. So it betrays its very founding purpose. The functions of that department are, to say from its legislation, kind of nebulous. There are functions that were written into law basically in the post-war period, where we began to put large amounts of federal funding into research and into student loans through the 1965 Higher Education Act. Most of these things could have been conducted and were conducted through the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare until they got split off and put into our Department of Education. It was controversial from the start. President Reagan vowed that he would abolish it, but instead he was around for its birth and its growth. And it has remained in its place despite considerable opposition over the decades. So now we have it. What does it do? Well, I'm going to personalize this a little bit. I was an administrator at Boston University in the 1980s and 1990s, where I had my first encounters with ED, as it's usually referred to. And probably the first of those was an encounter with the idea that accreditation needed to be reformed. And every college and university in the country that wants to be eligible for federal student money and for other sources of support from the federal government has to be accredited. The Department of Education controls accreditation by means of authorizing the bodies that can hand out accreditation. So by the late 1980s, it had become clear that accreditation wasn't doing some of the things that Congress had hoped it would. We had a sky-high default rate on student loans. People were looking for ways to rally the accreditors to do something about that. They were also concerned about other steps that the accreditors were taking. They were becoming more and more intrusive in the content of American higher education. So at that point, I began to get acquainted with what the Department of Education wanted. A couple years after that, Congress, being impatient with the reform, created something called the post-secondary review entities. SPRE is the acronym. And the government went on a spree with a set of very intrusive regulations over higher education. The Department of Education took hold of these and promulgated hundreds of new rules of how colleges and universities should operate. Colleges and universities weren't very happy about this. They fought back, and after 2 years, the sprees were retired. But during that 2-year interim in which we had sprees, there was a growing awareness of just how powerful and intrusive the Department of Education could be. There were other things going on as well. I mentioned the high student default rates. To what do we owe those? Well, we owe them to the ease with which the federal government handed out eligibility for federal student loans and the lethargy with which it acted to try to get students to repay those. So default rates became a standard feature in the way in which the department operated. What else was going on? Well, at the time I was working to attract some significant research funding to Boston University. We got a $30 million grant for photonics. I thought that was through the Department of Defense, which it was, but it turns out the Department of Education had its hands on it. And we had to work through the Department of Education as well. The growing awareness was that there wasn't anything a college or university could do in this country without having to be concerned with how the Department of Education regulated it. But on what grounds could that regulation exist? What were we doing as colleges and universities to invite this kind of heavy-handed oversight, usually by people who had limited or no experience in actually running colleges or universities? They were just people who, by means of their civil service appointments or their appointments by the executive branch, assumed control of higher education and thought that they knew better how to run it than the colleges and universities themselves did. This despite the fact that our colleges and universities were in some cases already 300 years old. They had managed for a good long time without the heavy hand of government, but now government was coming in to tell them how to do their work. If a college is to survive these days, unless its name is Hillsdale or a few other very small colleges, it has to receive the funding that comes through the Title IV of the Higher Education Act, originally passed in 1965. Title IV funding is, in principle, money that goes to the students to pay for their college tuition, but it's in the form of money that can only be spent at an accredited college and or university. The way in which the Department of Education handles this is that, first of all, it gets to decide which colleges are accredited by means of its own bureaucracy that determines who the accreditors can be. That's something called the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality, NASIQUI, which decides which accreditors can exist, and those accreditors exist only if they do the bidding of the department. The other thing is that for a college to be eligible, it also has to have certification through the Department of Education. So this is bookended. Certification to the colleges, certification of the accreditors, Both of them put limits on what a college can do in order to be eligible to receive Title IV student funding. Well, it's a kind of dry bureaucratic language, Title IV student lending, but what's that about? Well, it's about the, now I think it's $1.7 trillion in student debt in this country, all generated through this process, which was meant to ensure the integrity of lending to students and to the colleges that receive the funding directly, and which plainly doesn't work. It's a kind of disaster. The most recent chapter in that disaster was the inability of the Department of Education to put together the FAFSA form, the form which parents need to fill out if their children want to apply for federal student aid. There was a deadline, it was extended again, and even when it finally came out, it proved to be something that was so unworkable that many thousands of students couldn't even apply for federal aid. So we're talking about a bureaucracy that's not only cumbersome, but sometimes just gets in the way of its own business. What else is going on? Well, there really isn't any function in higher education that the Department of Education doesn't get its hands in. One of the important areas, which Teresa will be talking about in a little bit, is the Title IX of the, which was a law passed in 1972 that tried to eliminate sex discrimination in education, but which was weaponized by the Department of Education in 2012 through its so-called Dear Colleague letter, which drastically expanded the scope of this and made Title IX coordinators on campus the arbiters of what could pass as acceptable behavior on the part of their students. There'll be more to say about this as well, but this is a huge overreach on the part of the federal government, taking up territory that no law ever authorized. So there we are. That's the Department of Education as I know it personally. During the years I've been president of the National Association of Scholars, we've engaged with the department on perhaps a dozen separate issues. This is the first time in which we've tried to step back from the issue-by-issue approach to looking at the entire bureaucracy. What kind of thing is the Department of Education? And that turned into quite a sizable project. We have found hundreds of programs, and we've tried to identify them precisely and recognize how they work and where they can be improved. And that's why we've issued a 300-page report. To my knowledge, this is the first ever attempt to give an encompassing view of what the Department of Education is and how it works. I think we've done a pretty good job at that, but we will hear more about this in a moment. I started by saying that we are arriving at a moment when all of this is in flux. The Department of Education may soon be called out on that list of parts of the federal government that will be defunded or radically downsized. That may depend on the willingness of Congress to go along, since part of what the department does is through congressional authorization. But part of it also is just through bloat, the department's own willingness over the years to grab more and more territory and act with more and more authority. When I say it grabs more territory and acts with more and more authority, I should also add that sometimes it just ignores the authority it has. One of the areas in which we paid some attention in the past was a law passed by Congress in the 1980s, which required universities to report foreign gifts of $250,000 or more. The responsibility for enforcing that law went to the Department of Education, which just out and out ignored the law through most of its history. In the final years of the first Trump administration, Secretary DeVos finally picked this up and went to work on it, and within the space of a few months was able to ascertain several $1 billion of funding from abroad flowing into American universities. Well, why does this matter? Because American universities are meant, first of all, to serve the interests of the American people, not the interests of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other countries that were eager to put money in our pockets. So one of the first things that the Biden administration did was rescind the efforts of the Department of Education to enforce its regulations. Now, perhaps we're going to go back and see that law put into force again. So we're dealing here not only with acts of commission on the part of the Department of Education, doing things it really ought not to do, and acts of omission where it failed to do things that it was supposed to do. Probably the part of this that touches the American people most directly is student aid, but that's far from the only area in which its excesses and deficits come into focus. And with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague David Randall, who is one of the principal authors of the report, to tell us more about what's in it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, and some prepared remarks, but just, what's happening out in the world, it looks like the Trump administration is about to kill the education department, But policy reform is like a horror movie. There's always a third act where the monster comes back from the dead. And if you've watched the television show Stranger Things, you know there's some monsters that reconstitute themselves and come back as dangerous as ever. If you miss destroying even a small part of them, the education department bureaucracy is one of those monsters. So we need to be sure we have the right weapons. The policy reform equivalent of a Swiss Army knife that has a silver bullet, a stake, and a vacuum cleaner. The National Association of Scholars wrote Wasteland, the education department's profligacy, mediocrity, and radicalism, as a dungeon map for adventurers, a guide to the education department's labyrinth of programs and regulations, which it has used for 2 generations to radicalize America's schools, colleges, and universities. Wasteland sketches the education department's 4 main spending responsibilities: Title I funds for disadvantaged students, special education, Pell Grants for disadvantaged college students, and Ford loans for all college students. Wasteland also describes the bureaucratic and regulatory apparatus of Dear Colleague letters, case resolutions, and accrediting organizations that the education department uses to impose radical policies on American education. A DEI minotaur lurks in just about every education department, office, and regulation. The monsters bite, poisons, and infects. The education department imposed a resolution agreement on rapid city area schools in South Dakota, which required it to hire a director of positive school climate, in other words, to inject a radical activist into the local education bureaucracy so it could take over a new host. The current director's first words on her official webpage are a statement of race identity. I am a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. The education department funded restorative justice programs at the school district of Philadelphia, and school discipline has been so devastated that Philadelphia students now assault teachers with impunity. Quote, "The height of the crescendo hit this music teacher's school year when he was assaulted and chased out of the school building by a student. He never returned to work. He didn't feel safe, and his administration could not guarantee that the student would be removed from the school." And of course, the monster did nothing as Jew-hating mobs rampaged across college campuses last year, from Columbia University to Northwestern University to the University of California at Berkeley, tore down American flags and raised the banner of Palestine in its place. In Berkeley, Jewish students endure a constant stream of "kill the Jews" comments from their fellow students, and the education department shrugs its shoulders. The monster feeds chaos, not least by paralyzing the government when it is supposed to be doing its job. The monster has victims, individual school districts, teachers, and students throughout America who cannot study and far too often have been rendered physically unsafe by the radical activist perversion of the education department. Education reformers, all Americans, have good cause to want the monster dead. Wasteland recommends a series of comprehensive reforms to the education department to make it transparent and accountable to policymakers and the public. And here I confess that the extraordinary scope and rapidity of the reforms coming out of the Trump administration just in its first weeks means that a fair number of the reforms we recommended have been moved from our to-do list to our done list. Restore the 2020 due process rule, done. Redefine sex as biological in nature, done. Get rid of DEI, done. Get rid of the education department. We didn't actually recommend that, but not least because we weren't sure it was doable. But it looks like that might be in the done list by the end of the week, or even, I might say, the end of the day. Whatever we wanted it done, it seems like there's an executive order for it done or drafted. Except we don't think executive orders are enough to get rid of the education department once and for all. And there's an awful lot of details about reforming the education department that need to be nailed down properly. So even though the Trump administration has been saying, hold my beer, to an awful lot of education policy reform suggestions, we want to be sure that the reforms they make endure and that the monster doesn't come back to life. Education policy reformers still need the silver bullet for the education department, and Wasteland will tell them where the monsters lurk. Most importantly, the monsters have statutory protection. It's not just that the education department was established by law, or that dozens of different statutes refer to the Secretary of Education as responsible for executing a law. It's also that a very large number of individual programs actually are authorized by individual statutes. Federal statutes require the United States Department of Education to fund race discrimination at post-secondary institutions through laws. For example, Section 1059E, predominantly black institutions, is law, and it funds Trinity Washington University in the District of Columbia. And Trinity Washington boasts that it, quote, enrolls more than 100 undocumented students, unquote, many of whom are, quote, activists for justice, unquote. Section 1059G, Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions, is law, and it funds the Multicultural Center at Century College in Montana. The Multicultural Center co-sponsored with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion a real conversation about race with the predictable conclusion, no, we are not okay. Sections 1101 through 1101D, Hispanic serving institutions, is law, and it funds space tech scholars at Metropolitan State University of Denver at Colorado, which is explicitly dedicated to race and sex discrimination. Quote, space tech scholars will increase the recruitment, retention, graduation, and career placement rates of underrepresented students, i.e., Hispanic, female identifying, other minority, low income, first generation, and/or student veteran, as aspiring professionals in the domains of aerospace science and engineering, unquote. The Education Department funds thousands of such programs throughout America, and they have statutory warrant for all of them. Title I aid to disadvantaged students also is funded by congressionally authorized formula grants. So too is special education. Separate statutes authorize Pell Grants and Ford loans to college students. Education Department bureaucrats have far too much discretionary power, but Congress statutorily authorized dozens and dozens of different programs. Now, I expect that tomorrow's headline might be that a new executive order suspends funding for many of these programs, and a good thing too. But the statutes mean the programs can come back to life the moment a president with different priorities wins an election. And so long as the statutes protect the programs, even abolishing the education department won't mean much. That just means the different parts of the education department get transplanted into other federal departments. And then we won't face just one monster, but a dozen. The education department has sown dragon's teeth across America, and they can wait in the ground for years before they hatch. We need statutes and not just executive orders, or Trinity Washington in D.C., and Century College in Montana, and Metropolitan State University of Denver in Colorado will all be back in business again, ready to fertilize the radical academic bureaucracies dedicated to discrimination and denying liberty. Wasteland comes with a legislative guide to reforming the education department, which lists all the statutes that Congress needs to repeal to make sure that education department programs actually get ended for good. We can't afford to declare victory when we haven't actually won. Nor should we forget the fundamental legal theories that have justified a host of regulatory abuses by the education department. The last few weeks' executive orders have done an excellent job of declaring that DEI, the discriminatory concepts sometimes referred to as diversity, equity, and inclusion, should be pulled out by the roots. But the executive orders have not yet committed the government to some of the fundamental reforms we call for in Wasteland. Above all, we call for the federal government to renounce disparate impact theory, the theory that a policy violates our civil rights protection laws if it has a disparate effect by race or sex, whether or not it has discriminatory intent. Every policy is going to have some disparate impact. So this theory gives the federal government arbitrary power to prosecute anybody they like. The education department in particular must get rid of disparate impact theory to get rid of existing horrifying policies, such as the destruction of school discipline and the Kafkaesque nightmare of special education, where the education department now tells states and school districts they can be sued for having too many or too few racial minorities in special education. Then, too, the Trump administration has gotten rid of gender theory by executive order, but it has not explicitly rescinded previous generations of bureaucratic reinterpretation that violated and still violate the original intent of Title IX. Title IX was intended to protect women's equal access to education. It was not intended to address sexual orientation, and it was not intended to define sexual misconduct as sex discrimination. Sexual misconduct is worthy of severe punishment in court, but it is not a Title IX offense of sex discrimination that affects educational access, and to regard it as such is to provide the justification for the oppressive sex bureaucracy that is, among other things, the engine for the destruction of due process on campus. Education reformers only can slay the Title IX monster by restoring Title IX's original intent and removing sexual orientation and sexual misconduct from Title IX law. Statutes, disparate impact theory, and fundamental redefinitions of Title IX. All these are hidey holes where the Education Department monster can lurk, lick its wounds, and prepare to come back more dangerous than ever. The empire strikes back, to coin a phrase. After the last few weeks, we know the Trump administration is dedicated to swift and full reform of the Education Department, up to and including its formal abolition. But American citizens and policymakers still need a good map of the Education Department, and they still need recommendations for how to make sure the monster is well and truly dead. They don't want teachers to be afraid once more that their students will beat them up. They don't want another year when Jewish students are afraid to come to campus. They want to be sure there will be no sequels for the Education Department. Wasteland provides what American citizens need. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So impressed, David Randall, the lead author on this grand opus, Wasteland, but also with contributions from other researchers of the National Association of Scholars, Neetu Arnold, Mason Goad, and Nathaniel Urban. So I wanted to mention them. I am, again, Teresa Manning, the policy director at the National Association of Scholars and the person in DC. And on that point, I want to mention that the confirmation hearing for the next education secretary is scheduled for this Thursday. The nominee is Linda McMahon, a business titan who formerly had the Small Business Administration, and maybe just what the doctor ordered in terms of downsizing and restructuring the education department. And so I hope she'll be confirmed, and I hope we will be working with her to follow the map provided by Wasteland. I also wanted to mention, as David said, that the Trump administration has multiple executive orders, including two that target diversity ideology, which is a destructive and discriminatory ideology, but the Trump administration has been sued, most recently by the National Association of Diversity Officials and the American Association of University Professors. That complaint was filed a few weeks ago, and in my view, it wasn't very impressive, and I'm looking forward to the response by the Trump administration, and I certainly hope that they will be using the Supreme Court opinion from 2023, the Students for Fair Admission opinion, as solid ground for targeting these destructive ideologies and destructive programs, not just in the education department, but throughout the federal government. That opinion really did take aim at diversity ideology as itself being a form of racial stereotyping and racial discrimination. And so I see the Trump administration as simply running with that opinion, which deserves broad application and enforcement. So it's interesting that Peter noted the education department itself says it should be decentralized, if only. Unfortunately, DC attracts more politico-activist types rather than those who accept and work on the notion of decentralization. The education department really should be supporting the states and local entities, the state education departments, but it could set the tone. And one interesting thing is the vision that we should discuss. That should be the first thing that any education department has. and getting more specific about a vision, perhaps more discussion from DC, I would suggest simply about literacy. Basic literacy, the National Assessment Placement Tests have recently reported that fully 1/3 of 8th graders are functionally illiterate. So this is a place to start, that we should all agree that American students should achieve basic literacy in reading. But second, financial literacy, certainly for graduates of high school and our post-secondary schools, and the student loan crisis with the astronomical delinquencies and defaults on student loans show that even American college graduates do not have basic mathematical or financial literacy. And finally, civics literacy. David Randall is also the head of the Civics Alliance of the National Association of Scholars. Certainly, American high school and college graduates should know the basics of American government, of American history, of world history, and also the place of America in Western civilization. But by this metric, as well as really so many others you might want to use, American education has been a big failure. Test scores, student debt loans. And I want to mention, as a result of working on this report, the attitude problem we have with people in the education establishment. My experience in trying to report on the schools in Winchester, Virginia, and I think also the experience of my colleagues Nathaniel Urban in Ohio and Nitu Arnold for Philadelphia, was that school officials, both on the ground in schools and also in state education departments, as well, of course, as the federal education department, do not want to take calls, do not want to return calls, do not want to talk to any member of the public about what they are doing and why. There is a general distrust and arrogance, and even with the targeting of these diversity officials and other education bureaucrats, there is a sense from them of indignation, even as the nation is failing our students. They don't seem to realize they are part of the problem. And if they really did care about the education level, the real education of Americans, if they were decent, I would think they would happily resign from their positions and let others give it a try, because the record we have now is abysmal. One qualification, there's always a segment of the American student population that does okay, but that's possibly more a reflection on culture and home life than it is on our educational institutions. And in any event, the members of the education establishment certainly have a lot of explaining to do. With respect to the federal education department wanting decentralization and playing a subordinate and supportive role of the state education departments, Title IX is a very good example of how giving them an inch, they take a mile. The Title IX policy that Congress enacted in 1972 seemed benign and innocent to ensure educational opportunity for women, but the Education Department in Washington, D.C. has used that, as David Randall has explained, to radicalize the college campus, to advance militant feminism, and to completely gut the principles of due process by presuming guilt when a female student accuses someone of sexual harassment or sexual assault, withholding evidence, and not allowing for cross-examination and in many instances of appeal. And the National Association of Scholars report called Dear Colleague on Title IX goes into great detail about that metastasization of a decent federal statute that has simply been abused and weaponized. Last, I just want to sound a cautionary note about the importance of language and how the Trump administration has seized upon this. A lot of politicization takes place with the tweaking of language. As David mentioned, most recently, the redefinition of sex in Title IX to include gender and gender ideology, as if these terms were interchangeable. And we are also going to hear terms such as underrepresented, underserved, or marginalized as proxy terms for race-based discrimination that, again, the Students for Fair Admissions opinion by the United States Supreme Court found illegal. So I think we all need to be very sensitive to the words that we are using. I think the Trump administration is leading the way on that. So as David and Peter have said, a lot to be grateful for, but still a lot more to do and stay vigilant about. So those are my remarks. Peter?
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, David. We are open for questions to this huge audience we have around us. So, who would like to go first?
I'm wondering specifically on the issue of diversity statements, which is an academic freedom issue. This is something we've seen individual schools banning. We see anti-DEI legislation. Specifically, the question is there something needed to bolster academic freedom on campuses? We have, the Academic Freedom Alliance doing this on grassroots level, but is there something that can be done? And when we talk about a positive vision, perhaps, for the Department of Education, could it be something like, reviving norms of open inquiry or other things on campus?
If I may turn the answer to what the Education Department in particular should be doing, the accrediting organizations frequently press the colleges and universities to take actions to fulfill diversity accrediting requirements which have been put into the accrediting organizations. The diversity statements are partly voluntary efforts by the colleges and universities, but partly a response to the accrediting organizations. The Department of Education needs to enforce the new anti-DEI executive orders and make sure this applies also to that no accrediting organization which has a DEI mandate is itself accredited by the federal government. The federal government has also issued a new executive order saying that no recipient, including a university, of federal money can have the discriminatory ideology of DEI be allowed. That is itself a violation of civil rights. This certainly should be applied forthwith against colleges and universities which are using diversity statements and other such measures. This should be done, I should say, in the first instance by the Office for Civil Rights within the Department of Education. But if that happens to be destroyed in the next week or so, it should be done by the Department of Justice.
A more complicated answer to that. Academic freedom and freedom of speech, which are not the same thing, but it takes too much to explain exactly what that difference is, represent a really important pillar of higher education, but it's just one pillar. It's not the whole of it. Higher education is also about the pursuit of truth, for example, and the pursuit of truth sometimes gets in the way of an absolute version of freedom of speech. There's a good deal of controversy about this, even among those organizations like the National Association of Scholars that advocate for intellectual freedom on campus. But, for example, our counterpart, FIRE, takes a rather absolute view that freedom of speech trumps everything else. We don't. Our view is that we're in favor of liberal education, which requires open-mindedness, but it also requires a disciplined pursuit of truth, a willingness to distinguish between true and false narratives. One complication that enters into this picture is that a lot of Americans have come to believe that something they call hate speech is to be prohibited by our own First Amendment, let alone what college speech codes can do. Well, hate speech is, of course, not prohibited by the First Amendment, but it does present this problem if you're trying to engage students and faculty members in a orderly kind of education that is, as its ultimate goal, trying to get people to make sorts of distinctions necessary to get closer and closer to the truth, whether it's in the sciences or humanities. Something like virulent denunciation of other people on the basis of race or religion is a problem. And we don't want a form of free speech, in my view, that says it's open the gates to anything anybody wants to say at any time for any reason. So in that sense, let's have free speech, but let's have it in a society that is ordered by good law and good reason. Now, that's of course a lot easier to say than to do. The problem here becomes partly the one of distinguishing between speech and human action. And superficially, those sound like they ought to be easy to distinguish, but they're not really. Some forms of speech really are a form of action, and some actions are really very expressive and are meant to be a kind of speech. The Supreme Court has wrestled with these issues, but not really come away with any simple, decisive way to tell the difference. Ultimately, we're back into the realm of having to engage in discernment, of understanding that we live in a world that is morally ordered, not just scientifically ordered, and that's going to require having people who are sensitized to and determined to proceed on a path of ensuring that genuine open inquiry takes place, that some forms of speech that are definitely controversial are to be permitted, but other forms of speech which ought to be controversial maybe shouldn't be permitted. And what I mean by that is that when we have speech that is enforced through cancellation of those who violate the rules, speech that is prohibited by means of organized group pressure, that's distorting the doctrine of free speech in another direction. So with all those complications put into the picture, I think it's definitely a matter that those who want to reform the Department of Education have to keep in mind, but not with the idea that there's one simple, clear, decisive answer to fix the problem.
So, Louis, the DEI statements are a form of forced speech, and at public institutions, that would violate the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech, and in the Title IX space, there was a federal district court opinion out of Kentucky, which the Trump administration is now observing, and which has enjoined the Biden Title IX rule nationwide. Part of the court's reasoning was that the Biden Title IX rule would have compelled speech specifically using the pronouns demanded by gender ideologues. So there is a long record of cases against forced speech as a violation of the First Amendment, and there was a recent case out of Shawnee State University in Ohio that also dealt with this issue and also clarified that forced speech doesn't really have a place on campus.
I was an expert witness in that case.
Peter was. So Peter knows.
I have a question that it's not related to this issue, but our high schools are obviously failing our boys. And I'm wondering whether there is a federal role for expanding opportunities, for forcing high schools to expand opportunities for vocational education that would meet the needs of our student male populations better.
So, go to the vocational education first. One of our recommendations is that the existing Office for Career and Technical AE, OCTI, be moved from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor to be integrated into the general workforce training. And this is a mere few $billion a year, petty change at the Department of Education, but it does actually matter. It is, in point of fact, a form of, it goes better with labor force creation than in the Department of Education, and it means that the Department of Education can't focus on its core functions because this is one of many things that it's distracted by, when this really is part of the core function of the Department of Labor, getting us a properly trained, prepared, educated workforce. You also mentioned stuff about boys, and this is an overlapping issue. I would say that a great many Department of Education programs, as parts of their discrimination, include sex discrimination. The beneficiaries are intended to be girls, but this does mean that there's all sorts of programs which boys are denied access to. And part of getting rid of the general discriminations should be to make sure that boys and girls have equal access, equal opportunity for everything funded by the Department of Education.
I just add to that, I agree that boys have been neglected. This is a dangerous and unjust thing. Part of it is the women's movement. So there's been women in engineering and women in business and women's lounges. And actually, for schools receiving federal funds, those are prima facie Title IX violations, discriminating based on sex. And there is a University of Michigan professor named Mark Perry who has made this his singular mission to file complaints against universities and I think also high schools that run programs along these lines that exclude, by their name, exclude men. And he has had some success, but I think they've overdone it on the women, and it's led to a neglect of our boys. I completely agree.
I can add a little bit to this. Part of the reason why boys are given short shrift in education has to do with the turn in education overall towards a therapeutic model. And boys, being rambunctious, are particularly susceptible to being pointed out as in need of therapeutic intervention in the form of medication. They're diagnosed with hyperactivity disorders at a hugely disproportionate rate. We've also seen the rise since the early 1990s of something called social emotional learning, which, like a lot of these other terms that get thrown around in the Department of Education and elsewhere in education, sounds very benign. Social emotional learning means learning how to be nice to the people around you, be friendly, be talkative, so forth. What lurks behind that, however, is the idea that boys should be more like girls, and to the extent that they're not like girls, they need to be treated. They need to have some of this therapeutic intervention. They also are getting an education that is less suited to their developmental needs. Now, we don't have to invoke some strange new theory of human psychology to get here. Most of humanity, for most of the existence of the human race, has understood that boys and girls are different, and boys need to be addressed in a manner different from girls. That has been turned on its head to being a world in which our schools from a very early age prioritize the needs of girls and if not ignore, actually turn against the needs of boys and pathologize them. So what can be done about this? Well, it's certainly going to be more than the need to reform the Department of Education to get our hands around this. This is a cultural change that has to be reckoned with. Certainly, to the extent the federal government has any positive role to play in these matters, it could play one here, but we also have to look beyond this to awakening the American public to just what a rooted bad concept social emotional learning has become, and how we need to shift education back from therapy to actual education. Okay, it appears that we have exhausted the set of questions that are coming in. I do want to say just a few more things to wrap this up. The existence of this report is, I think, an important event in American higher education right now. Of course, our job is to get it noticed, and if you're listening to this broadcast, you can help with that. We have rushed it out the door. We had intended to be a little bit more leisurely in setting up a launch event that would draw national attention to it, but the speed by which things are happening now in Washington, D.C. convinced us that we needed to put haste over leisure, and this is why it's coming out now. The work itself is 300 pages long. It has some nice colored graphs in it, but it's by no means light reading. We've gone systematically through a dense federal bureaucracy and tried to make sense of it. We put in things that we think were helpful to the reader, like a very well organized opening pages that give a roadmap of where things are, and a well done index, so in case you're looking for a particular program, you ought to be able to find it quickly. So it's browsable, and not just something that demands that you set aside a week or two to read it. But at the same time, if you did take a week or two to read it, you would have an extraordinarily vivid picture of how one branch of our government is actually working. I'm proud of the work on this. This has been a labor that took the better part of a year to accomplish, and even that was at a breakneck speed. We considered while we were doing this work to be engaged in a kind of audit of the Department of Education, and part of the audit were the case studies, which Teresa gave one example, but we also did in-depth examination of the paper record or the digital record of what the department is doing. All of this is very nicely synthesized by David Randall, who took on the huge task of putting all these pieces together in a coherent form. As I said, I'm proud of what we've accomplished, and I hope it will make a difference. I expect that the members of the House and Senate committees that deal with this, members of the Doge group that are working on these matters, will find in this work something that will enhance what they are attempting to do. And finally, we intend this to be something that is a contribution to the American people. It is so hard for us ordinary citizens to really know what our government is up to at any one point. That means that people need to turn to intermediary organizations. We're far from being the only one who try to do some of that work for them, but we're not writing this thing for the experts. We're writing it for you. And if you're an expert, you're included in that, but basically this is meant to be a way in which we can open the eyes of American citizens to how better to govern our self-governing republic, a self-governing republic that is always in danger of slipping out of our hands, we citizens, into the hands of people, experts, who are not particularly well inclined to treating the republic as something that doesn't belong to them, but belongs to all of us. So as a blow towards a liberal republic, we offer you this book. I hope you will find good use for it, and thank you.